Hi, it's Jeff Garber, mortgage expert, and in this video, I'm going to answer a question that we get a lot in the industry, and that is, what are points? So what we're going to do is we're going to explain what points are, all right, and if it makes sense to pay them, and I'm even going to share with you another option that you might want to do instead of paying points. Now, as a disclaimer, in this video, I am not giving financial advice at all. I always recommend that you seek advice from a financial professional. Everything in this video is an example. The rates that I'm using are not quotes or the market rate today either. Everything is merely just an example to illustrate to you how all of this works. So we're going to break it down for you, and by the end of this video, you should have a good understanding of what points are. So I'm going to get myself out of the way, share my tablet, and let's get started. So the best way to explain points is first to bring it back to what we already know. So, and this is a blinding flash of the obvious here, but we all know that 100 pennies equal $1. Great, right? We also know that 50 pennies is equal to 50 cents, right? Again, no brainer. We also know that not everything costs exactly $1, and not everything costs exactly $2. In other words, something might cost less than $1, which we would represent in cents, right? Like if something costs 50 pennies, 50 cents, or if something costs $1.75, well, we know we can do that as well. And again, I know this is the obvious part, but what I want you to realize is you have to almost think of the same thing when it comes to points, except we're using a little bit of a different terminology, right? And the terminology we're using comes from the world of finance. And unfortunately, it spills over into the consumer world when it comes to getting a mortgage. So these weren't created to confuse you. They were actually created because we follow a lot of the rules of finance. So what do I mean by that? Well, instead of pennies now, we're going to deal with basis points, okay? And so 100 basis points would equal 1 full point. Just like 25 basis points would equal 1/4 of 1% of a point, or 0.25%. So when we're dealing in points, 1 point is 1%, okay? 25 basis points would be 1/4%, all right? 50 basis points would be 0.5%, just like 50 pennies would be 50 cents, which is half of $1. Well, 50 basis points would be half of 1 point. Now, why am I telling you this? This is where it's going to make sense for you now. So what we do with points is we take your loan amount, and we're going to pretend you have a $200,000 mortgage loan amount. We're going to multiply that by the points, all right? So if it's 1/4% in points or 1% in points, we're simply going to multiply 200,000 by the 0.25% or by the 1%. And in this example, 1/4 of a point would cost $500. 1 full point would be $2,000. Now, what do we use points for? Well, in the mortgage world, what we want to offer you, and I'm being very simplistic here, is we want to offer you an interest rate that doesn't cost you anything. Okay, that's the free rate. So let's pretend today's interest rate is 5%, and that doesn't cost you any money to get. And you say to me, hey, I'd like to have 4.75%. Okay, I'd like to stay in the 4s. Can I do that? Well, the answer is yes, but that's going to cost you money, because it's going to cost your lender or bank money to get that rate. We have to buy that rate, and that cost is passed on to you as the consumer, and it's expressed in points or a fraction of. So, for example, if 5% is the free rate, and you would like 4.75%, and I tell you that's going to cost you 1 point to get that, well, we would basically take 1 point or 1% of your $200,000 loan, and that would equal $2,000. So for you to get 4.75%, you could pay 1 point, and that'll cost you $2,000. So basically, we'd be adding $2,000 to the closing costs. So I hope that is starting to make sense. Now, let's say that it only costs 0.25% to go from 5 to 4.75%. Well, in that case, if that's what the cost was, then we would take 0.25%, multiply that by the loan amount of $200,000, and now the point, or a fraction of the point, would cost $500. All right, now I hope this makes sense. Now I know you have a lot of questions, and as a rule of thumb, and this is really only a rule of thumb that does not work in every market, but you could say that for every 1 point that you pay, you could expect your mortgage rate to lower by 0.25%. So if 5% is a free rate and you pay 1 point, that could lower your rate to 4.75%. Now, it doesn't always work out like that. Markets change and there's a lot of variables, way too complex for this video. So it's going to be really challenging to always tell you that 1 point will lower your rate 0.25%, but you can use that as a rule of thumb, okay? And when it comes to interest rate, you always want to look. So when you see advertisements for mortgage rates and you're looking around and you see one that's considerably lower than the rest of them, you need to look in the fine print. And that fine print in there could be buried in the small fine print that it actually costs you 1 or 2 points to get that rate. So you have to be very careful when you're looking at interest rates. You want to make sure you know if you're getting a free rate, or is there any points or fraction of a point or more than a point. You know, a point could be 1%, it could be 0.75%, it could be 1.25%. All right, just like my analogy above, not everything costs $1 or $2. It could be cost something in between or less. And so we express that in what are called points. Okay, now there are 2 types of points that you need to be aware of. The points that are most important are called discount points, because you are using discount points to buy your rate down, get a discounted rate. So if we have a 5% rate and we want it to lower to 4.75 and we want to pay 1 discount point to do that, well, then we can accomplish our goal of going from 5% to 4.75% and possibly adding $2,000 to do that to our total closing costs. Okay? The other type of points are the same, meaning 1% is 1% of the loan amount, no matter what type of point we call it. A discount point will reduce your interest rate. There's also origination points. All right? Sometimes you might have a fee charged to you to originate your loan, and that might be expressed in points. So right off the bat, you might see something that says, you know, to work with Bank A, and you find out what their fees are, you might find that Bank A has a 1% origination fee. And that simply means that whatever your loan amount is, you multiply that by 1%, and that's what the bank is charging you to originate their loan. And it has nothing to do with interest rates. So you need to be careful with that. So let me just summarize real quick before we switch screens here, that there are 2 types of points. 1 is a discount point, 2 is an origination point. All right, discount points are used to reduce your mortgage rate, your interest rate. Origination points can be charged by a bank or lender, and that is a cost for them to originate your loan. All right, so you want to make sure you understand the difference. So when you're looking at the loan estimate, which is the form that you get to see all the costs and fees of the loan, that you understand the difference when you see origination point or discount point, because it should be labeled as such. All right, now I know this can be a little bit of a confusing topic and you might want to rewatch this a couple times. It's actually simple, but because it's simple, it's so easy to say, well, it can't be that easy. It's got to be more complicated than that. And so we mix up the numbers in our head. All right, but again, as a quick summary before I switch screens here. All right, so all you do is take your loan amount, multiply it by the points, and that'll give you a dollar amount, and that will be the cost. And that cost will either be for you to reduce your interest rate, or it might be an origination cost to originate your loan. And yes, you could still buy your interest rate down if a lender charges you an origination point or 2 as well. Okay, let me jump to the next screen here. So does it make sense to pay points? Well, let's talk about that for a second. So let's say you have a loan amount of $200,000, and using our example, 1 point is equal to $2,000, right? We take 1% of 200,000, that equals $2,000. I also told you that we can buy the rate down from 5% to 4.75%. All right, well, P&I stands for the principal and interest. So if we took your $200,000 loan, amortized it over 30 years, your principal and interest at 5% will be $1,074 a month. All right, if we reduce your rate to 4.75%, your principal and interest will go from $1,074 to $1,043, or a $31 a month saving. So by paying $2,000, you could save $31 a month. And so the question is, does it make sense to do that? Well, if we take $2,000 divided by $31 a month, that's going to tell you that in about 64.5 months, or 5.38 years, you will recoup the $2,000 that you paid to save $31 a month. So basically what that means is if you're going to be in this loan for more than 5.38 years, meaning you're going to stay in the house, not refinance, all right, you will break even in about 5 years. And then anything after 5 years is money in your pocket. So if you want to compare this out over 30 years, if you did the 5% interest rate, you would pay a total of $186,000 in interest over 30 years. If you went to 4.75%, you would pay $175,000 in total interest. Now remember, this assumes that you are going to keep this loan for 30 years. All right, and this is just an example because nobody really does keep loans for 30 years. But everybody bases their numbers on 30 years. This is kind of ironic. You know, we get very emotional about interest rates and payments, and everybody says to me, yeah, Jeff, 1/8% makes a big difference over 30 years. And while I agree with you 100%, if you don't keep your loan for 30 years, it's kind of hard to make that statement and validate it. But we're going to do that for this example. We're going to pretend that you are going to keep this loan for 30 years. And if so, if you had an extra $2,000 to put into your transaction to lower your rate 0.25% to save $31 a month, you would save $11,000 in interest. So the question is that worth it to you? And if so, then it might make sense to pay points, right? And this is where I always recommend speak to a financial planner or even your loan originator. Your loan officer can help. I certainly have a lot of conversations with people about does it make sense to pay points. Well, let's look at another example here. So what if? Well, okay, what's the alternative to paying points? Well, what if you said, all right, I'm just going to take my $2,000 and I'm going to invest it for 30 years. I'm going to get with a planner, a financial advisor, and say, look, I have $2,000 that I'm okay putting away for 30 years. Because remember, we're comparing everything on 30 years right now, right? We're going to assume you're going to keep this house and this loan for 30 years without selling or refinancing. And if you did that and you said, I want to invest $2,000 a year, a one-time lump sum investment of $2,000 for 30 years, well, let's remember, at 5%, you're paying $186,000 in interest. At 4.75, you're paying $175,000 in interest. This is on the loan. And remember, if you use 4.75, you'd save $11K. Well, if you invested $2,000 and you got a 6% rate of return, well, in about 30 years, you would grow your money to about $11,000. All right, so that would be your break even right there, 6%. But let's say your financial planner got you 9% rate of return. Well, over 30 years, that 9% compounding would then add up to $26,500. So you can clearly see that depending on the rate of return that you get on your money, the question would be, do I put $2,000 into my mortgage to save money? Or do I maybe put $2,000 in an investment vehicle for 30 years? And look, there are many, many more things that you could do with $2,000. You could start a reserve account. Maybe you want to pay off other debt that has higher interest. Okay, my point is, no pun intended, is before you decide to pay points, discount points to reduce your rate, there might be a better place for it. And if so, a good time to know that is before you close on the loan. Okay? So, in summary, what we talked about today were discount points and origination points. And we now know that 1 point is 1% of your loan amount. And points come in, you can have points lower than 1. We can have 0.25% or 0.5% or 1 point or 1.25%. And that's all determined by the lender and the markets. And all we do is take the points, multiply that by the loan amount. That's going to come up with a dollar amount for exactly how much it's going to cost us to originate either originate the loan or use discount points to reduce the rate. So I know I got a little bit long in this video, but I wanted to give you a full definition with an outlook on how discount points and origination points work. I hope this helps.